Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here, because the gaslighting is already in full swing. Donald Trump is using the federal government as a personal weapon, not figuratively, not rhetorically, literally. The Justice Department, the intelligence community, the civil service, the security clearance system, all of it being twisted into instruments of revenge. And they're not even trying to hide it anymore. They are saying the quiet part out loud. He told us exactly what he would do. I am your retribution. That wasn't a metaphor. That wasn't campaign bluster. That wasn't locker room hyperbole. That was a mission statement. And now we're watching that mission unfold in real time. Critics hunted, careers destroyed, reputations dragged through federal indictments, security clearances ripped away, watchdogs fired, prosecutors purged, agencies gutted, one by one, systematically, coldly. And if you're sitting there thinking, this can't possibly be how a democratic government is supposed to function, congratulations, you still live in reality. Because this isn't normal, this isn't policy, this isn't ideology. This is state power being repurposed for personal vengeance. And honestly, it's pathetic. It's the behavior of a man so consumed by grievance that he is willing to burn down the very institutions that once protected him just to settle old scores. What makes this moment especially chilling is not just what's happening, it's how casually it's being done. No national emergency explanation, no legal complexity, no tortured justification, just a simple, brazen message. If you crossed me, the government is coming for you. Make no mistake, this is not about law and order. This is not about accountability. This is not about cleaning up corruption. This is about punishment. Raw, petty, personal.
And let's talk about the absurdity for 1 second, because the hypocrisy here is so thick you can cut it with a knife. This is the same man who spent years screaming that he was the victim of a weaponized Justice Department. The same guy who claimed every investigation into his own conduct was political persecution. The same guy who demanded loyalty oaths to the Constitution while openly floating the idea of arresting his political enemies. And now that he controls the levers of power, suddenly weaponization is fine. Suddenly purges are justified. Suddenly vengeance is called restoring integrity. It's not integrity, it's a vendetta wrapped in the American flag. And here's the most dangerous part. This isn't being done in one dramatic sweep that shocks the conscience all at once. That would trigger emergency alarms. This is being done gradually, bureaucratically, quietly. A prosecutor here, a clearance there, a watchdog fired, a critic indicted, a scientific integrity officer removed, death by 1,000 administrative cuts, each move isolated enough to defend in a press release, but taken together, this is a blueprint for authoritarian consolidation. If you're feeling like you're taking crazy pills watching this unfold, you are not alone, because the exact behavior Trump once claimed proved that democracy was under attack is now being openly executed by his own administration. The difference? This time, he's the one holding the knife. And just wait, because once you look at the receipts, once you see the names, the dates, the firings, the indictments, the clearances stripped, the judges forced to step in, the pattern becomes impossible to deny. This is not a coincidence, it's a campaign. But wait, it gets worse. Let's move from the outrage to the receipts, because once you trace the paper trail, this stops being a controversy and starts looking like a coordinated operation.
Start with what just happened in federal court. A moment so damning, it almost reads like satire if it weren't so dangerous. Two of the most high-profile revenge indictments that Trump's Justice Department brought against James Comey and Letitia James were just thrown out by a federal judge. Not dismissed on the merits, not tossed because the evidence was weak, but because the very prosecutor Trump installed to go after them was illegally appointed. Let that sink in. The indictments themselves were built on a foundation that never should have existed in the first place. The judge's words were not subtle. She ruled that all actions flowing from the defective appointment were unlawful exercises of executive power. Translation: the entire prosecution was tainted from the start. Not a technicality, not a footnote, a constitutional failure. And suddenly, all that bluster about law and order collapses into what it really was, a political hit job assembled through procedural shortcuts. Now, why does that matter? Because Trump didn't just accidentally pick the wrong prosecutor. He overrode normal DOJ vetting, ignored experience requirements, and installed a former loyalist from inside his orbit, someone whose primary qualification was political proximity, not legal independence. That's not how the Justice Department is designed to work. That's how a personal enforcement arm is built. And this wasn't limited to James Comey and Letitia James. This was just the most visible domino to fall. Look at what happened next. Jack Smith, the man who led the classified documents case and the January 6th election subversion investigation, is now under investigation himself. Not for evidence tampering, not for misconduct in court, but for allegedly violating the Hatch Act, a statute meant to limit political activity by government employees. His attorneys called the accusations imaginary and unfounded, and they're right to emphasize that multiple judges already reviewed his work and rejected claims that the prosecutions were improper.
So what's the real purpose of this investigation? It's not discipline, it's retaliation through process. It's not enough to beat your critics politically. The goal is to bury them in legal exposure, drain their resources, tarnish their credibility, send a warning to the next person who dares to cross you. And Trump didn't stop with prosecutors. He moved on to security clearances, one of the most quietly powerful tools in government. He revoked or suspended clearances for more than 100 current and former officials. Vice presidents, cabinet secretaries, intelligence officials, military leaders, people who spent decades serving in classified roles, suddenly cut off overnight, not because of compromised security, but because of political disloyalty. Former President Biden, Kamala Harris, Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Hillary Clinton, critics from the January 6th investigation, Republicans who dared to defy him, even retired intelligence officials who signed a letter years ago about Russian disinformation. Many of these people didn't even have active clearances anymore, but Trump revoked them anyway. Why? Because the punishment was the point. The humiliation was the point. The message was the point. If you are watching this and thinking, why revoke a clearance that isn't even active? Congratulations, you just uncovered the scheme. This was never about national security. This was about branding people as enemies of the state. And it didn't stop there. He fired the head of the National Archives, the very agency that flagged his mishandling of classified documents in the first place. No explanation, no misconduct, just gone. The deputy archivist, also forced out. Career professionals replaced or sidelined in one blunt message. If your agency ever holds me accountable, you're next.
At the FBI, he fired senior officials who had any connection to January 6th investigations or the Mar-a-Lago documents probe. One former acting director said he wasn't even given a reason. Another senior official who vowed to defend his agents from retaliation was told he needed to retire. Not a suggestion, not a choice, a command. Then came the independent watchdogs, the people specifically tasked with protecting federal employees from political abuse. The head of the Office of Special Counsel, which shields whistleblowers from retaliation, fired. The chair of the board that reviews illegal firings, also fired. One of them sued. A federal judge ruled Trump's action unlawful, and the official was reinstated. That right there tells you everything you need to know about the legality of these purges. This isn't efficiency. This is institutional sabotage wrapped in executive authority. And then, because no retaliation tour would be complete without targeting science, he went after NOAA officials connected to exposing Sharpiegate. Remember that episode when Trump literally altered a hurricane map with a marker to support a lie he had told? The investigators who ruled that Trump officials violated scientific integrity rules by backing the fake map, those are the people now placed on administrative leave. Years later, no new allegations, just delayed vengeance. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. Truth-telling is being retroactively criminalized, and if the pattern still isn't obvious enough, look at what happened at FEMA. The acting director testified that dismantling the agency would endanger disaster response. The very next day, he was fired. Then, more than 180 FEMA employees, current and former, signed a letter warning Congress that Trump's restructuring could lead to catastrophic failures. Days later, multiple employees were put on administrative leave. The consequence for speaking up is now bureaucratic exile.
Even the Bureau of Labor Statistics wasn't spared. After a weak jobs report made Trump look bad politically, he fired the commissioner, accusing her without evidence of manipulating data for political purposes. No investigation, no proof. A bad number hit his polling, and someone had to be punished for it. This is what weaponization actually looks like. And the scope just keeps expanding. Former military leaders who criticized him, prosecutors connected to the Epstein investigation, DOJ attorneys who didn't toe the line in politically sensitive cases, intelligence officials whose assessments contradicted his narrative about foreign adversaries. The common denominator isn't criminal behavior. The common denominator is disloyalty to Trump. And the justification? Always the same recycled line. We're restoring integrity. Give me a break. Integrity is not firing civil servants because the data embarrassed you. Integrity is not revoking clearances for political rivals who don't even have access to classified material anymore. Integrity is not illegally appointing a prosecutor to go after your personal enemies. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting. Because if this were genuinely about rooting out corruption, we would see neutral standards, transparent investigations, career professionals making decisions based on evidence. Instead, what we see is a one-directional purge. Only critics fall, only opponents get targeted, only watchdogs get punished, only investigators get investigated. Not loyalists, not enablers, not people who broke the law on Trump's behalf, just the ones who stood in his way. And honestly, that's the tell. That's how you know this has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with retribution institutionalized. But this didn't start in the second term. This moment didn't appear out of thin air. Because once you zoom out, once you pull back from these individual firings and indictments and clearance revocations, you can see that this is not chaos. It's a strategy. And that brings us to the real problem.
Because once you pull back far enough, this stops looking like a series of isolated grudges and starts looking like a doctrine, a worldview, a model of governance built not on policy, but on payback. This is not Trump reacting impulsively to one bad headline. This is Trump executing a long-telegraphed plan to remake the federal government into an extension of his personal will. He told us in advance. He promised retribution. And now we're watching what that word actually means in practice. We've seen this movie before, just in slower motion. In the first term, the appetite was there, but the machinery wasn't fully captured yet. He fired James Comey for refusing to pledge loyalty. He publicly threatened judges. He leaned on prosecutors. He dangled pardons as rewards. But there were still friction points. There were still career officials who slowed things down. There were still institutional guardrails that forced him to try to hide the abuse. Those guardrails are now gone. The difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is not intent. The intent has been consistent since day one. The difference is capacity. The second term is what happens when grievance is married to preparation. And that preparation didn't begin after the election. It began years ago. Let's talk about the Schedule F blueprint, because this is the hidden infrastructure behind everything you're seeing. During his first term, Trump quietly created a new employment category that would allow him to reclassify tens of thousands of civil service workers as political appointees, stripping them of normal job protections. It was blocked before he left office. Then, the moment he returned, it was resurrected. Why? Because mass retaliation requires mass vulnerability. You can't purge an independent bureaucracy unless you first make it fireable at will. So what you're watching now, the firings, the demotions, the forced retirements, they're not improvisational. They're the execution phase of a long-designed purge architecture.
And the targets are not random. Notice the categories of people being hunted. Investigators, prosecutors, whistleblower protectors, intelligence analysts, scientific integrity officers, disaster response officials, election administrators, career data professionals. These are not ideological opponents in Congress. These are fact generators. These are the people whose job is to create an evidentiary record that cannot be spun, and that is exactly why they are so dangerous to someone who governs through narrative rather than reality. Because authoritarianism does not fear dissent. It fears documentation. It fears paper trails. It fears independent verification. It fears career professionals who don't care who is in power, only what the data says. And so those people must go. Now watch the pattern repeat across every domain. At justice, investigators become defendants. At intelligence, analysts become suspects. At science, scientists become political actors. At labor, statisticians become saboteurs. At elections, administrators become traitors. Same script, different agency, every time. And the messaging is always identical. We are restoring integrity. But the integrity being restored is not institutional integrity, it's personal loyalty. This mirrors the exact logic used in historical strongman systems. Not Nazi Germany, not Soviet Russia. I'm not making lazy analogies. I'm talking about the mechanics of authoritarian consolidation. Step 1, discredit independent institutions as corrupt. Step 2, replace neutral professionals with personal loyalists. Step 3, redefine dissent as sabotage. Step 4, punish selectively to build fear. And step 5, normalize the fear. And here's where the danger deepens. This isn't happening through a single dramatic coup. This is happening through procedural abuse. The most effective authoritarian systems don't abolish institutions, they hollow them out while keeping the names on the doors. The Department of Justice still exists. The FBI still exists. The National Archives still exists. NOAA still exists. FEMA still exists. But their independence is being replaced, quietly, with conditional obedience.
Now let's connect this to Trump's own grievances, because the pattern of who gets targeted tracks almost perfectly with the people who embarrassed him, constrained him, or told him the truth about him at critical moments. The archives asked about missing classified documents, leadership fired. Prosecutors pursued his business fraud, they get investigated. Intelligence officials contradicted his election lies, clearances revoked. Scientists corrected his hurricane lie, they disappear years later. Labor statisticians released bad economic data, fired. FEMA officials warned about disaster risk, removed. Election officials rejected fraud claims, threatened with prosecution. Capitol riot investigators followed the evidence, purged. Every single time Trump was forced to accept an objective fact he didn't like, someone connected to that fact eventually became a target. That is not coincidence. That is retrospective punishment as governance style. And here's the most revealing psychological component of all. Trump does not retaliate merely to neutralize opponents, he retaliates to reverse the moral ledger. In his worldview, every investigator is a criminal, every witness is a conspirator, every prosecutor is corrupt, every intelligence officer is plotting, every scientist is lying, every civil servant is disloyal. It is a total inversion of accountability. He is never the one under scrutiny, everyone else is. And this inversion is how authoritarian systems stabilize themselves, not by proving innocence, but by redefining guilt. Now, ask yourself, if every institution that once checked you is now being punished, what remains capable of stopping you next time? That's the future this strategy is building. Because prize what's happening beneath the surface, Trump is not merely retaliating against individuals, he is deterring an entire class of future behavior. Every federal employee watching this understands the message perfectly well.
If you investigate me, you will be investigated. If you contradict me, your career will end. If your data embarrasses me, you will be accused of treason. If you defend the Constitution over loyalty, you are disposable. This is how self-censorship metastasizes across a bureaucracy. People don't get fired first, they stop speaking first. They stop writing first. They stop documenting first. They stop pushing back first. And once that internal resistance collapses, the rest doesn't even require force anymore. The system begins to police itself. And that's why the focus on just one indictment or one firing misses the point. The real transformation is cultural. It's the slow conversion of institutions from truth-based bodies into fear-managed organizations. Make no mistake, what is being engineered here is not just revenge, it is behavioral control of the state. This is also why Trump is so obsessed with purging deep state officials, even when they are apolitical career servants. Because as long as there are people inside the system who are loyal to evidence instead of ego, the fantasy he wants to project can never become fully real. He does not want a government that serves the public. He wants a government that serves him. And now for the first time, he has the time, the preparation, the loyalists, the employment frameworks, and the judicial pipeline to actually attempt it at scale. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of this entire story. Not what has happened so far, but what this strategy is clearly positioning him to do next. Because once retaliation becomes normalized, once fear becomes institutionalized, once independence becomes optional, once loyalty becomes survival, the question stops being who will be targeted next.
The question becomes, what will be impossible to stop afterward?
And that is exactly where this is headed. And that brings us to the end game. Make no mistake, the end game of this campaign is not just silencing critics. The end game is a government where the fear of personal retaliation replaces the rule of law. And once you cross that line, the entire operating system of a democracy changes. Because here's the reality that Donald Trump doesn't want you to see. You don't need tanks in the streets to dismantle a republic anymore. You don't need a suspended constitution. You don't need martial law. All you need is a loyal Department of Justice, a terrified civil service, and a public conditioned to normalize abuse as politics. That's it. That's the recipe. And every ingredient of that recipe is being assembled right now in broad daylight. Think about what has already been normalized in just a short period of time. We have now normalized the idea that prosecutors can be assigned not based on independence or experience, but on personal loyalty. Career professionals can be fired because their data embarrassed the president. Investigators can be turned into defendants because they followed evidence. Scientific integrity officers can be punished years later for correcting a presidential lie. Security clearances can be revoked not for risk, but for revenge. Whistleblower protection itself can be dismantled from the inside. Let that sink in. Every one of those norms existed for a reason. Each one was built over decades in response to real historical abuse. And now, one by one, those firewalls are being deliberately dismantled, not because they failed, but because they worked. And here's the terrifying truth. What you're seeing right now is still the soft phase. This is the conditioning phase, the normalization phase, the phase where the public is trained to accept weaponization as just another partisan news cycle. The phase where outrage is spread thin across so many scandals that nothing feels shocking anymore.
But power doesn't stop expanding once it tastes immunity. It accelerates. Today, it's prosecutors and civil servants. Tomorrow, it's regulators, then journalists, then nonprofit watchdogs, then universities, then judges. Because once the principle is established that state power belongs to the person at the top, not to the law, every independent center of authority becomes a threat. And don't take my word for it, take his. Trump has already declared that people who criticized him committed treason. He has already telegraphed that dissent is not disagreement, it's disloyalty. He has already framed evidence as sabotage. He has already labeled oversight as conspiracy. Those aren't slips. Those are doctrinal statements. And once that doctrine becomes embedded in the machinery of government, everything downstream of it changes. Here's how this evolves if it goes unchecked. Regulators stop enforcing rules against politically connected corporations. Prosecutors decline cases that touch presidential allies. Inspectors general self-censor their findings. Intelligence analysts soften conclusions that contradict preferred narratives. Disaster response agencies hesitate to issue warnings that conflict with political messaging. Economic data becomes suspect not because it's wrong, but because it's inconvenient. This is how truth becomes optional inside the state. And once truth is optional, corruption becomes permanent. Because if no one can safely document abuse, if no one can safely investigate wrongdoing, if no one can safely contradict power, then law enforcement stops being a neutral function, it becomes a selective weapon. Enemies are prosecuted, allies are protected, facts become flexible, silence becomes survival. That is not a hypothetical. That is the historical arc of every democracy that slid into personalized power. And I want to be very clear about something uncomfortable. This only works if enough people decide it's just politics. Authoritarian systems don't rise because everyone suddenly becomes evil. They rise because large numbers of ordinary people become resigned. They rise because institutions hesitate.
They rise because defenders of democracy assume someone else will step in first.
That's the trap, because Trump's entire strategy is built on the assumption that courts will move slowly, civil servants will fear for their mortgages, media will chase the next outrage, voters will grow numb, and opponents will fragment. And while everyone waits for the big breaking point, the quiet architecture of control keeps getting installed. Schedule F wasn't loud. Clearance revocations aren't dramatic. Administrative leave isn't cinematic. Forced retirements don't trend on TikTok. But together, they rewrite how power actually operates. Now, ask yourself the most dangerous question of all. What happens when the next genuine constitutional crisis arrives? What happens when there is a disputed election? What happens when a state refuses a federal directive? What happens when a court injunction directly blocks an executive order? What happens when a whistleblower uncovers criminal conduct inside the administration? In a functioning democracy, those events trigger lawful restraints. In a retaliatory state, they trigger personal punishment. And once the retaliatory model is established, the incentives flip overnight. Officials stop asking, "Is this legal?" They start asking, "Will this make him angry?" That is the pivot point where law stops guiding power and fear replaces it. And here's the most sobering reality of all. You cannot simply vote out this kind of damage after it hardens, because by the time personalized power finishes eating through institutional independence, elections themselves become procedural rituals, not actual checks. The machinery meant to enforce outcomes has already been bent to serve the person at the center. This is why the early phase matters. This is why the boring parts matter. This is why civil service protections matter. This is why inspector generals matter. This is why due process matters. This is why independent prosecution matters. This is why security clearance norms matter.
Because once those layers are gone, the only thing left between the leader and unchecked power is personal restraint. And Trump has shown us repeatedly what his personal restraint looks like. None. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This retaliation campaign is not a tantrum. It is not a spasm. It is not improvised rage. It is the construction of a governing model, one where loyalty is safety, dissent is danger, and accountability is inverted. This is not about one man's temperament anymore. This is about the system that is being reprogrammed around him. And the most dangerous lie being sold right now is this one, that institutions are strong enough to handle it. Institutions are not abstract beings. They are made of people. And people can be fired, people can be intimidated, people can be marginalized, people can be financially ruined, people can be isolated, people can be made examples of. That's how institutions fall, not in one collapse, but in thousands of private calculations of risk. So here's the bottom line, without drama, without exaggeration, without hysteria. A government that weaponizes law against critics is no longer a government bound by law. A government that punishes truth-tellers is no longer capable of self-correction. A government that turns investigators into targets is no longer protecting the public, it is protecting power. And once that transformation completes, the next abuses won't look shocking, they will look routine. That is how democracies die now. Not with coups, not with dictatorships declared overnight, but with retaliation normalized, with silence incentivized, with fear institutionalized. If you are watching this and feeling unsettled, you should be. If you are watching this and feeling angry, you should be. If you are watching this and thinking someone else will stop it, that's the most dangerous feeling of all.
Because no institution will save itself. Courts cannot enforce their rulings if the executive ignores them. Agencies cannot protect integrity if their guardians are fired. Oversight cannot function if witnesses fear retaliation. Elections cannot constrain power if enforcement mechanisms are hollowed out. The only remaining constraint becomes public vigilance, sustained, informed, relentless. Not outrage for one day, not trending hashtags, not performative condemnation. Relentless attention, relentless documentation, relentless pressure, relentless refusal to normalize what should never be normal. Because the moment retaliation becomes just another policy dispute, the damage is already done. And that's the choice this moment is forcing on everyone who still believes in constitutional government. Either retaliation becomes the new operating system, or accountability survives as the core principle of the republic. It cannot be both, and the window to choose is closing.